The engine cuts out. There's silence. Nothing but the wind, the creak of the airframe, the distant thrum of the searchlight sweeping the sky below. In the cockpit of a Soviet biplane, somewhere over Nazi-occupied territory, a young woman holds her breath. She's cut the engine deliberately, gliding in low and silent, invisible in the darkness, invisible to the guns that would tear her apart if they found her. The Germans have learned to listen for the sound of these planes, so she has stopped making sound altogether. They have a name for her, for all the women who fly like this night after night, dropping their payload and vanishing before the searchlights can catch them. They call them the Night Witches. And even hardened soldiers, men who have seen the worst of the Eastern Front, admit that the Night Witches are terrifying. She releases the bombs, kicks the engine back to life, banks hard and disappears into the dark. She is barely 20 years old and will fly over 1,000 missions before the war is done. And history will barely remember her name. Hey, I'm Luke. I'm an author of archaeological adventure novels. I travel the world looking for stories to put into my books and to share with you right here on the Adventure Story Podcast. Right, just before we get started, before we dive in, most podcasts grow through recommendations, so please share this with any adventure lovers in your life. Right, let's get started. Today we're talking about the women who took to the skies when the world expected them to stay on the ground. These are women who flew faster, who flew higher and further than anyone else, and who, in many cases, are missing from the history books. These are the women of the skies, and I think it's long past time that we told their story. Let's start with a woman who was not only a world-class aviator, but she convinced Stalin to let her fly. Marina Raskova wasn't the woman in the cockpit I was describing, but without her, that woman may never have been there at all. Raskova was the driving force behind the Night Witches, and without her, those wooden biplanes never would have left the ground. The Soviet Union's first female navigator, she was a record-setting aviator. In 1941, with Nazi forces advancing into Soviet territory, Raskova did something extraordinary. She convinced Stalin, not a man famous for taking other people's ideas on board, to allow women to fly in combat. The result was 3 all-female air regiments, the most famous of which was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, later renamed the 46th Guard Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, also known as the Night Witches. Flying wooden biplanes left over from the previous decade, they operated exclusively at night, often flying without parachutes, without radar or radio. They went into combat in these fragile planes that were slow and exposed and terrifyingly vulnerable. They flew in pairs, one pilot, one navigator, carrying only what the small aircraft could hold. And to avoid detection, they switched off their engines on the final approach and glided silently over enemy camps, and then dropped their bombs and disappeared back into the dark before the searchlights could find them. The only sound those below heard, just before the attack, was a soft whooshing, like the sweep of a witch's broomstick, hence the name. They flew over 20,000 missions over the course of the war and dropped thousands of explosives. Many of them were named heroes of the Soviet Union, the country's highest military order. Raskova herself died in 1943, leading her regiment to the front. She was the first woman in the Soviet Union to be given a state funeral, and her squadrons fought on without her until the very end of the war. The Night Witches changed the course of the war, but 2 decades earlier, a young woman from Texas was fighting a very different kind of battle entirely. One that didn't involve bombs or searchlights, just a country that had decided before she'd even tried that the sky wasn't for her. Bessie Coleman didn't just break the rules, she flew straight over them. Born in 1892, the daughter of a sharecropper, Coleman decided she wanted to fly at a time when flight schools in the United States turned her away, both for being a woman and for being black. So she did what no one expected. She learned to speak French, sailed to Europe and earned her pilot's license in France in 1921. She returned to the States as the first black woman and one of the first people of Native American heritage to hold an international pilot's license. And that's when the show began. Queen Bess, as the crowds came to call her, wowed audiences across the country. With loop-the-loops and figure-8 dives, she became one of the most recognised aviators of her era. But she wasn't just a performer. She refused to fly at segregated events. If black spectators couldn't watch from the same area as the white ones, she simply didn't fly. And she had a bigger dream too, to open a flight school for African Americans. Unfortunately, that never happened. In 1926, she died in a crash while preparing for a show, thrown from the aircraft when a mechanical failure sent it into a spin. She was just 34 years old. Her legacy, though, continues to this day. Jacqueline Cochran sold cosmetics by day, but at weekends, she broke records. Cochran came from nothing, abandoned as a child, raised in poverty in rural Florida, working in cotton mills and beauty salons before she ever set foot in the cockpit. She learned to fly in the 1930s, and once she started, she just didn't stop. By the time she was done though, Cochran held more speed, distance and altitude records than any pilot in history, man or woman. She was the first woman to break the sound barrier, the first to pilot a bomber across the Atlantic, the first to fly a jet across an ocean. During the Second World War, she helped build and lead the WASP program, the Women Air Force Service Pilots, whose more than 1,000 female pilots ferried military aircraft, testing planes, and handled essential flying duties so the male pilots could be freed for the combat roles. She made one of the first blind instrument landings ever recorded too, and she competed in and won some of the most grueling air races of her era. By the time she died in the 1980s, she held over 200 aviation records. Now, let's talk about Hannah Reicht. She wasn't just a pilot. She was the person they called when they needed someone to fly something no one had ever flown before. In the late 1930s, she became the first woman to fly a helicopter, a Focke-Wulf FW-61, one of the world's first practical helicopters. She went on to become the first woman to fly a rocket-powered aircraft and later a jet fighter. She tested prototypes, experimental designs, one-offs, and machines that barely anyone understood yet. She set over 40 records in altitude and endurance in both powered aircraft and gliders. Her story's a complicated one though. Reicht flew for Nazi Germany, and with conviction. She met Hitler and remained loyal to the regime long after the war had ended. Although that's part of her story, and it doesn't erase what she did in the air, it means we can't tell her story without it. History, after all, isn't always comfortable. And then there's Jerry Mock, who wasn't out to make history at all. In 1964, armed with a map and a Cessna 180, and what she later described as a straightforward desire just to go somewhere different, she became the first woman to fly solo around the world. She had no modern support crew, no satellite navigation, and no global media circus. Just a small aircraft, careful planning, and a formidable amount of nerve. And more than 20,000 miles of ocean crossings, radio failures, iced over wings, and that particular brand of stubbornness that tends to make history, she made it. The journey took 29 days and 21 stops. She navigated with radio beacons and a sextant, flying for hours at a time over open ocean with nothing but her instruments and her instincts. By the end, she had set 7 world records. Then there's one name when you mention women in aviation that everyone knows. And yet the story behind the name is richer, stranger, and more complicated than the legend suggests. Amelia Earhart first became famous as the first woman to fly across the Atlantic, but as a passenger, not the pilot, and that distinction mattered to her. In May 1932, 5 years after Lindbergh's famous crossing, Earhart took off from Newfoundland, aiming for Paris. She made it as far as a field in Derry, Northern Ireland, buffeted by storms, ice forming on the wings, and a leaking fuel gauge dripping onto her shoulder. Under the circumstances, that was more than enough. She had proved what she set out to do. She could do it herself, under her own power and on her own terms. She set records for speed, for altitude, and for distance throughout the 1930s. She co-founded the 99s, an organisation for female pilots that still exists today. She pushed for women to be taken seriously in the air at a time when most people thought the very idea was faintly ridiculous. Then, in 1937, she set out to fly around the world. Somewhere over the Central Pacific, she and her navigator Fred Noonan disappeared. No wreckage was ever conclusively found and no bodies have been recovered. She was 40 years old and had already changed aviation forever. If Amelia Earhart is the name that everyone knows, then I think Beryl Markham is the one that everyone should. Born in England in 1902 but raised in colonial Kenya, Markham spent her childhood running barefoot through the bush, learning to track animals and survive in the African wilderness. She became the first woman licensed as a racehorse trainer in Kenya. She was, by any measure, already extraordinary before she took to the air. She learned to fly in the early 1930s and quickly established herself as one of the finest bush pilots in Africa, flying supplies, mail and medicine to remote outposts across Kenya and Sudan, navigating by landmarks and instincts over terrain that had no charts worth trusting. In September 1936, she attempted something no one had done before, to become the first woman to make the brutal east to west solo crossing of the Atlantic, flying against the prevailing winds. The eastward crossing had been done. Flying west was harder, longer and colder because that wind was working against you every mile of the way. She took off from England just before midnight, and 21 hours and 25 minutes later, her fuel exhausted, her engine sputtering, she crash-landed in a bog in Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia. Barely, but she had made it, the first person ever to fly the Atlantic solo, east to west. These women came from different countries, different eras, and in different circumstances. Some flew in wartime, some in peacetime. Some fought for their country, while others fought for their right to be in the air at all. What I think they shared was a refusal, be that quiet or loud or gentle or ferocious, to accept that the sky belonged to anyone but them. I love these stories so much that I've based one of my series on them. Co-written with John Hopton, our Nora Sierra Bird Airborne Adventures follow the pursuits of a retired Air Force pilot who just wants to be left alone to run her flight school in the Caribbean. Of course, the world has other plans. Her adventures start in The Shadow of the Sunstone. If you're interested, you can find it wherever books are. The Shadow of the Sunstone. This is the Adventure Story Podcast. Thank you so much for hanging out today. It's great to do episodes like this and get to go behind the books a little bit, because you might have seen the stories that I've written, but maybe you don't know the things that inspire those stories, the real lives that we've sort of looked into and thought about when coming up with our characters. So as I say, if you're interested in aviation and thriller novels and adventure stories surrounding aviation, do check out the Nora Sierra Bird Adventure Stories wherever books are sold. Now, if you've enjoyed the show, please subscribe, please like and share. It will take you just seconds, but really helps me spread the word about this show. And if you need more adventure in your life, and I think you probably do, don't we all? You might like to join the Adventure Society. This weekly newsletter is your ticket to travel with me, to share real-world adventures and to find out when a new story or a new season of this podcast drops. Link is in the show notes. And if you're a fan of adventure stories like the one we've talked about today, check out my books, lucerichardsonauthor.com. Bon voyage, enjoy the adventure, and I'll see you next time.